Good morning, Latin America. Good afternoon, Europeans. Good evening, Central Asians. This is a very unusual medium for a teacher because I'm in a bunker in the middle of Sao Paulo. Off we go. So this is my favourite quotation about pronunciation. I mean, is it teachable at all? Or do we perhaps throw activities at students and pray? And it seems this very old quotation from David Brazil, to me, it's always been my favourite pronunciation quotation. You know, it's not so much a question of whether we can teach it or whether students can catch it, but more or less what he's saying, I think, is that we as teachers need to be consistently trying to help students to make the best use of the opportunities which our teaching and their attendance in our classes offers. I think that's a really important way of looking at teaching. Sorry, it's simply, in a part-time classroom, how can you best help students with teaching pronunciation? That's really what I'm going to look at. I'm going to look at some pronunciation activities for stress, for recording vocabulary, for teaching intonation, for teaching sounds, and I'll make some general comments too. But please feel free to throw out your questions all the time. Okay, so on we go. This is a typical classroom. Imagine the teacher has written something like that on the blackboard. And that's all very well if you're teaching spelling, and the students might well copy this down. But if a student took that home, a Brazilian student, for example, he might say, I received or received an email. A Spanish student might look at this at home and produce something like, I received, or something like that. So any teacher who asks students simply to copy sentences from the blackboard, phrases from the blackboard, even individual words from the blackboard, what you're really teaching is spelling. You're teaching a written form of English. You're not really helping with pronunciation. What I think it's imperative to do is to do that, which is to mark up the text as if it were something that the students are saying as opposed to speaking. So highlighting the stress with boxes. I use quick boxes on the blackboard. Underlining works in books, but I much prefer stress marking with simple boxes, because when students copy from the board, if you use underlining, for example, often they don't quite underline the right syllables. I've also there, as you can see, I've crossed out the silent E, which so the students can see at least that the E before the D, the ED ending, would be silent, as it normally is in most regular past simples. And I've also marked the link there. So I received an email. I received an email. That linking thing. So there are three features there which I think any teacher really should be trying to incorporate into their teaching to help students move away from writing and spelling towards actually pronouncing English. It's probably the simplest way of getting students more interested in spelling, beginning to ask interesting questions about the relationships between spelling and pronunciation. And above all, if you think about teaching, probably the most important document in a language classroom is not really the lesson plan, much as your director of studies may think so. It's actually the record which the students take home. It's the notes that they take home. If they only take home a written version, as in the previous slide, with no help at all with pronunciation, it seems to me you're still slightly stuck in Shakespearean written English. If you move in this direction towards helping them those features, then what you're doing, I think, is helping students to notice. And that's our first job, is helping students to notice how connected speech joins up. Consistently sensitizing students, making them sensitive to the relationships between spelling and pronunciation, the links in connected speech, and providing systematic exposure to students so that they actually are consciously getting a diet, so they can begin to make the catching process more efficient. So that's the link back to David Brazil. All of these things you can see on the screen now, you can mark up. Stress, links, silent letters. And it was interesting, I've just done a tour of Central America with Richmond, and I went to Honduras, I went to El Salvador, Guatemala, lovely places, but I spoke to more than 2,000 teachers, and I would say fewer than 10 of the 2,000 teachers I spoke to were actually marking stress, marking the links, crossing silent letters, which is a very low proportion if you think about it. We still, I think, in secondary schools, perhaps in primary schools, late primary, even in universities still, the teachers still are primarily teaching writing and spelling as opposed to focusing primarily on pronunciation, which has a knock-on for everybody. Okay, Let's move on to a sounds activity now, which has probably been my favourite one over the years. Some of you have seen me speak around the world, will probably have seen this before, but what I love to do is create two characters, like sort of Willy and Vera. And Willy is the W sound and Vera is the V sound. And then you ask students to sort of complete the chart with words for Willy, which go down the first column, which are W, 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 and Vera, which is V, 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 V. So many nationalities, as you know, have problems with this sound, and they might come up with something like that, which is Willy comes from Wales, he eats watermelons, he plays water polo, W, 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 etc. Vera, on the other hand, she comes from Venice, vegetables, she eats the violin, Venus, and so on. So what you're doing is getting students to brainstorm and go, watermelons, water, wally. So effectively the students are repeating the sounds, looking at their English in a slightly different way from perhaps what they're used to, whilst they contrast the sound. If you look at the activity closely, if you look in the left-hand column, what the students are doing, it's practicing, everybody's favourite, the third person S, comes, eats, plays, of course. But what they're generating, when they give the feedback, they're saying Willy comes from Wales, Vera comes from Venice. And so they're producing sentences. They're not worried about the third person S. The primary focus is pronunciation. And this is a very flexible activity. I've done this with 8-year-olds, 18-year-olds, 80-year-olds. I've done it with the nearly dead. I've done it all around the world. And it seems to me it's one of those activities which has always worked for me. When you focus on teaching Brazilians, I'm talking about the R and her problem, which is a big issue here. I'm living now in Rio de Janeiro, lucky me, but Brazilians would call it Rio, so the R and the her problem is quite an issue. So again, if you focus on the R and the her with two different characters, you can practice those sounds. Again, this one is practicing the present simple. If I can summarize that, within that activity, there are 4 key aspects of pronunciation teaching, I think. Students are drilling themselves, Rio, hill, etc. So whenever students, when you have a tricky sound, you could ask students to give me 3 words beginning with B for Spanish speakers, for example. They say bed, bath, banana. And then you say, okay, which is the biggest? And they go bed, which is the most expensive, bed, which is the smallest, banana, etc. So you can get students to rank and classify pretty much anything at any time. When you're asking students to fill in those columns, then the students aren't really thinking and going through the mother tongue. They're sort of trying to access the English words which they have in their head in a slightly different way. They can't really go through the mother tongue. If you're clever and you pick out the sounds which they don't have so much in the mother tongue, and that's what Jenny Jenkins says, that we really should be focusing primarily on the sounds which they don't have in the mother tongue. There's no reason on earth why we should teach all the sounds in English, but primarily focusing on the sounds which are going to stop students from being fairly easily globally comprehensible with the English they use. So polishing the sounds which don't exist. When they're trying to find words like bath, bedroom, banana, assuming B, for example, doesn't exist in the mother tongue, then they can't really go through translation. So I love pronunciation, because it's a way of escaping from translation when you're working, for example, as most of us do, with monolingual classes. The third point there is that what we need to do with pronunciation is integrate it into our everyday practice. Lots of teachers, I think, globally attend. They sort of, they run through their textbooks. They don't have time, so the first thing they chop out is pronunciation. Message to students: it's less important than other things. So what I'm suggesting here, if you go back to the exercise here, if we go back 2 slides and we look at the exercise, the students are producing sentences. Willy comes from Wales. Vera comes from Venus. So you're actually focusing primarily on pronunciation, but you're getting the third person S. Sorry, it's the wrong way around. That's it, yeah, like that. The third person S as well. So in a sense, you're getting 2 things for the price of 1. And we know everybody likes a bargain. So here, by focusing on pronunciation and then at the same time incorporating grammar, I'll give you some more examples in a second, you get 2 things for the price of 1. So rather than separating pronunciation, what we should be doing, I believe, is trying to integrate it into the very core of our exercises, up-fronting it perhaps even before grammar. And without help like this, my fourth point. How else can we help students to really learn and practice the sounds which they don't have in their mother tongue? Here's another example for you. If you look at that, probably the world's most common activity, find someone or somebody who. But all I've done is just put a focus on sound into the activity. Here again we are using the third person S, but it's hates having homework, enjoys English exams, wants to work as a waiter. So if you select carefully when you're doing, for example, find somebody who, you can bring in a pronunciation focus whilst you're still doing all the other things which you wanted to practice too. So again, it's like 2 for 1. And if you think about that, most of the activities which we use on a regular basis, you can easily throw in some sounds focus too. By the way, I hope I'm not talking too quickly. I'm not making many jokes yet. They're coming later, don't panic. Here's a third example of the same thing. This time I've changed the left-hand column. So now we're practicing irregular past tense verbs, but with a dual focus on the sound L and R, which is very useful, for example, with Japanese or Chinese learners. So I hope you see the flexibility within the exercise, that 2 for 1 notion. Moving on to intonation now, this is something I've been experimenting with a lot recently, is one-word dialogues, helping students to sound a little bit more fluent, not worrying about make a sentence, make a sentence. As a profession, we're obsessed with this, make a sentence, make a sentence. And my feeling is we don't speak in sentences. Generally, we write in sentences, but we speak in phrases and broken lumps and so on, not just sentences. So I've been asking students to do things like this, something like, happy? Yes. Sure? Well. Problems? Yes. What? Please? That type of thing. So getting students to communicate primarily using individual words, not thinking about grammar, but thinking about how they can stretch themselves in terms of intonation. Here's another example for you. Lunch? Yes. Tomorrow? No. Now? Okay. Really? Yeah. But that type of thing. So you can see students can learn very quickly to communicate with one word, primarily thinking about stretching themselves and using intonation. This is how I would use it in a classroom. Give students 2 beginnings, happy or tonight, and off they go, having a one-word dialogue, moving away from this obsession with making sentences to using individual words to express meaning, primarily using lexis and intonation. I hope that's clear. It's worked for me at many, many levels. You can move on. Another example this time with 2-word dialogue. So what I do to students, for example, is giving them 4 or 5 choices. Enjoying this? Eaten yet? Last night? Like soccer? This weekend? Etc. And the students have 2 words, 2 words, 2 words, 2 words, 2 words to try and communicate as much as they can. Again, primarily using intonation. Or you can do it with student A having 1 word and B having 2 words, and they try and it's a very good idea to ask students to write dialogues like this for a homework activity, because they really then begin to think about which word is the most expressive word, rather than simply thinking about making sentences. And then you have a summary here. I hope it's large enough for you to see. If you double click on the screen, it will make it larger. A summary of my favourite activities for teaching intonation. I love 1 or 2 word dialogues. I love using moods, different faces, characters, roles, different situations, where the students are expressing as much through the power of the voice and the intonation, rather than just focusing on the lexis. Things like tracking, following and listening to native speaker models, watching TV, using subtitles, rehearsing, imitating. Imitating before they speak is much better than asking students to read aloud without any practicing at all. Repeating and recording themselves. So the blue ones are primarily my favourite intonation teaching activities. My strategies as a teacher, I love to do things like this, for example, to hum, or to whistle, or even to sing. I'm not going to sing for you. Sing phrases before, during, or after you say something, just to get students focusing on the music. Or you conduct it. Would you like a cup of tea? That type of thing. Getting students to notice the music, exaggerating. Really? That type of thing. The more you exaggerate as a teacher, the more, I think, more fun students will have imitating, copying you, and then noticing similar patterns in the movies they watch, the songs they hear, and so on. Obviously, when students sound really bored and they say, I love you, teacher, which sounds completely flat and totally non-credible, then if you respond, do you, equally back, throwing back bored intonation, so they hear what they sound like. And of course, lots of recording activities, which I'll show you in a second with a couple of websites. And then perhaps teaching some rules, for example, tag questions, rising, falling, WH, yes, no questions, that type of thing. I know they're not exactly rules, they're more generalizations, but we worry about this a lot, I think. We can't give rules because they're wrong, but to me, if you give a rule about, for example, WH questions normally fall, for example, and then the students hear somebody saying, what's your name? With a rising intonation, and they say to teacher, but teacher, you told me they fall. I mean, most teachers, oh my God, I shouldn't give the rule, they found an exception. But again, if you think about it, what the students have done is that they've assimilated your rule, they've noticed the pattern, they've heard something different from what you've said, and they've had the courage to come back and say, teacher, I don't think that's right. I mean, hallelujah, the students are thinking, and so I think generalizations are good things to give about pronunciation, because when they find the exceptions and so on, then it's a point of dialogue, and it's proof that they've assimilated the rule, and they're really beginning to catch the opportunities which are coming at them, to notice the language which you've heard. So I don't worry too much about offering rules of intonation, because it's a stepping stone towards progress together. Here's a couple of websites for you. Perhaps my favorite website is vocaroo, which is wonderful. You can record up to 5 minutes of speaking on this. So what I like to do for homework is ask students to describe their family, describe their room, or something like this. They go to vocaroo and they say, I have a sister, 2 brothers, a mother, and a dog. And they click to record themselves, and then they make the sentence. I have a mother, 2 sisters, a cat, and a dog. And then they go to the next page, and they press listen, and they click on listen. Okay, and if they like what they hear, then they can send it to the teacher. So you've got a means there of evaluating students orally. If they don't like it, if they're unhappy with their pronunciation, they press record again, and they can go back and listen to themselves again. I've had students record themselves 10, 12 times until they're happy with their own pronunciation before they send it to the teacher for evaluation. And this I've been using for the basis of portfolio evaluation, digital recordings of students. Great website. It allows us at last to have proof for the directors of our schools that the students can speak English, and so you can bring this into your evaluation much more, depending less on written tests and more on spoken and pronunciation activities, with proof, digital proof, that the students can say what you are teaching. Another great website is My Brain Shark, which this is an extraordinary website which I was introduced to by Russell Stannard, and one of my favourite websites, if you don't know it, is his own website, which is teachertrainingvideos.com, and there you'll see an introduction by Russell how to use My Brain Shark in the classroom. My Brain Shark is terrific because it allows you to upload PowerPoint, you can upload Word documents, PDF documents, even videos, so you can get students giving full presentations, a bit like what I'm doing now. And then they can put their voice on, and then they can be judged, evaluated on the pronunciation that they're putting into their own presentations. It's a much fairer way of evaluating students rather than asking them to stand up and speak for a minute, because normally they've memorized a text. And of course Latin learners, where I am now in this continent, tend to impose a Spanish pronunciation or a Portuguese pronunciation on words when they're reading aloud from the words. When they give their own presentations, a bit like I am now, sort of more spontaneously speaking, you tend to get better pronunciation. Okay, so I hope that's useful for you. I'm going to speak for about another 3 or 4 minutes, and then I'm going to take any of the questions that you have. So I hope you're pumping questions at Cynthia. Cynthia, is there any feedback on my speed? Am I going too quickly? Or do people seem to be understanding me? Or has everybody switched off yet?
People can understand you, Paul.
Thank you,
Nobody has complained.
Okay, well, that's good. Since they didn't pay, I can't give the money back. That's fine, that's good. Okay, so let's move on to a couple more activities, which I think are quite interesting. So this is what I'm working on now. Again, it's quite a small text, so if you double-click on the screen, you'll be able to read it. But this is a text which I'm putting into a level 1, a sort of an elementary course book, which I'm writing at the moment. If you look at that, you would think, oh my, it's got lots of complicated words. It would be very difficult to use that. But if you look at the text now, you'll see that what I've done is I've highlighted the stress in a lot of words. And an awful lot of those words are very, very familiar to Portuguese speakers, Italian speakers, French speakers, Spanish speakers, because they are cognates. So and my own feeling about pronunciation teaching is that some of the literature suggests that we shouldn't focus as much on word stress as on intonation or on unstress. But my feeling is that in this continent, in particular in Latin America, if you begin to focus on word stress in cognates, what you're doing is opening a fantastic door for students, because you're allowing them to, by focusing primarily on pronunciation, there's no problem of meaning. All the words which are highlighted there, the meaning is clear because it transfers directly from L1 into English. So, but the word prosthetic, I mean, how often have you taught the word prosthetic to a beginner? Or even athlete is a difficult word for students, or inspired, for example. These are difficult words for students to pick out. But if you include them in a text, you can offer students a much richer text to learn from. And it's exciting, I find, for students to find that there are so many words in common between English and the Latin-based languages. So that's what I'm doing now. I believe very strongly that we've been holding back Latin learners from learning more English more quickly by teaching them international English as opposed to cognate-friendly English. We're showing them the parallels between the language, giving them access to suffixes and languages, words like obstacle, which you would never teach in a global course. But when you're focusing on material designed for this continent, you'll find, I think, that you can give a lot more difficult words in the text, and it's less condescending to the students because you're embracing a lot more complex language more quickly. So that's something I think is a big important step in pronunciation teaching, showing students words which they can recognise and helping them to pronounce similar words a lot more of the time. I'll give you one more example and then I'll throw it open to questions. This would be the end point of that activity, giving them 8 adjectives: active, athletic, courageous, determined, energetic, heroic, ordinary and strong. All of which most people would avoid completely at a low level of language teaching, apart perhaps from strong. But my belief is that for any Latin speaker, they can recognise those words and they can begin to use those words much more quickly. So for years and years when we talk about cognates, we've always been afraid of false friends. But there are far more friends than false friends. So I do think that's an important activity to embrace cognates and help students to learn the pronunciation traps in words which are similar between the two languages. Okay? I think that's just one more example here, which I think you'll find interesting. This again is something for a material which I'm developing at the moment. You're the first people ever to see this outside the Richmond family. But it's just, when you introduce, for example, these 15 words of places, if you look at the 2 groups, 1 to 8, are all cognates. So you don't need, for example, to illustrate those words. What you need for students to do is just to work out where the stress is so they can begin to say them quickly. If you look at words 9 to 15, they're all non-cognates, and bookstore, library is a false friend too for Latin learners. So those words you do need to illustrate. You need to teach them in a different way. So what I'm working on is trying to separate lexis, which is easy and accessible for the students that I'm teaching in this continent, Latin American students, Spanish speakers, Portuguese speakers, and teaching them primarily with a pronunciation focus, and then other words which are more difficult, which don't translate, which are traps, which are difficult for them. These you need to focus much more on remembering the new pattern, the spelling, the meaning, and so on. So these are just some of the things that I've been thinking about recently in the area of pronunciation. Let me tell you a funny story to finish. This is a good story to embellish the importance of pronunciation. 1968, many years ago, Charles de Gaulle was having dinner at the White House, and sitting next to him was his wife. And beside her was an official who spoke no English, but he wanted to, no French, but he wanted to talk to her. So he said, "Madame de Gaulle, what do you think is the most important thing in life?" And she had a little think, and then she said to him, "A penis." And her husband sitting next to her slightly shocked by this, and he leaned over and he said to her, "My dear, I believe in English it's pronounced happiness." Okay, so pronunciation mistakes are all around us, and I think that's a great way to help students to remember things. It's just telling them stories which involve pronunciation, the 2-for-1 activity, incorporating pronunciation into your day-to-day activity rather than leaving it as a distant cousin. Bring it in, upfront it, and I think with a bit of luck, the dialogue with students will begin. Okay, so thank you very much for aguantating me in this, the very first Richmond webinar. I hope it's not the last. Thank you very much indeed. Enjoy your teaching. Bye-bye.